Hey, my name is Mustafa. I'm a second year medical student, and today I'll be talking about 3 techniques that I use in med school. These are some techniques that I wish I knew in undergrad. However, now that I found out about them, I want to share them with you guys. And so these techniques are some techniques that a lot of people have spoken about, and I'll be breaking them down a little bit so that way you can understand how the process works with these techniques and how to help you become more effective and more efficient in the way you study and have more time for things outside of school. I've split this video into 3 techniques, the first one being spaced repetition, the second one being the Pomodoro Technique, and the third one being time management. I've put the timestamps down here below or on the screen, and you can pick which technique you want to learn about if you don't want to watch the whole video. Spaced repetition. Spaced repetition already says it in its name. It's the repetition of information spaced out over time. It's in contrast to cramming. Cramming, essentially you're learning the information the day before the exam and you're only going to learn it for a day or two and then you're going to forget it. Whereas spaced repetition, you're going to have it long-term wise. Back in undergrad, I never used my time wisely. I would always cram for my exams and I would never get the mark that I always wanted. And when it came to it in med school, I had to pick it up. And so when I found this spacing effect, basically the spaced repetition, I was able to change my marks significantly. And so this is why I want to share this with you guys. Here are some articles that I found here somewhere on the screen that supports that spaced repetition actually positively correlates with academic success. The theory behind spaced repetition is based off the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve essentially tells you that the information that you've learned over time is exponentially forgotten. And we've all been through that when you learn something and over time you forget it. With this spaced repetition, let's say for example, a day later, you've learned that information again, up to 100%, and you forget it over time, but a little less. After your second repetition, you go back up to 100% again, and then you forget even less. And then after your third repetition, and then after your fourth repetition, it's the same idea. You go up to 100% and then you forget less and less. And this is the idea of solidifying the information that you've learned into your long-term memory. One thing you need to take into consideration is how much you're spacing out these repetitions. And this is based off the idea that when you forget information and your brain is trying to retrieve that information, you're actually solidifying that information even more. So let's say for example, between the initial time you've learned the information and your first repetition, that's the most forgotten. So your first repetition would be a day. And when you remember that information again, and then you'll forget less. You're gonna have to space out after that first repetition, maybe 2 or 3 days. And then in that 2 or 3 days, you'll have your second repetition. And then after that, after your second repetition, maybe you do a week. Depending on your timeline, you would change that up. But the idea here is that between your repetitions, you're going to progress the days. So you're going to increase the time between each repetition. And that way, you're solidifying the information by making it harder for your brain to retrieve the information. And that way, it solidifies information later on when you remember it again. There are 2 ways that I implement spaced repetition in the way I study. The first way is Anki. Anki in itself probably needs its own video because there's so much to do with Anki. Like Anki has so much versatility and there's a lot of settings that you can change and creating your own cards and putting in decks. So I would leave it for another video, but for the sake of this video, I'll just explain what it is briefly. It's a flashcard app that uses its own algorithm that spaces out information and repeats information for you. And it uses like a 3-button system where you hit easy, medium, or hard, depending on what you name those buttons. And let's say, for example, you hit hard, you will see that card again maybe 20 minutes later. Whereas if you hit easy, maybe you'll see it a week later. It just really depends on the settings that you set for the Anki card. But the idea here is that it uses an algorithm that spaces out those flashcards of little bites of information in the way that you know it. So if you don't know that information, you'll see it more often. And if you do know that information, you'll see it less often, basically playing off the forgetting curve. The second technique that I implement is something called the 4-pass rule. The 4-pass rule essentially states that you need 4 passes of a lecture from front to back thoroughly to really learn that material for an exam. The way I implement this is my first pass would be going to class. At this point, my first pass, I would be looking to gain as much information from the lecturer, and I would write down questions on the side and write little notes and little informations on my lecture slides, and that way I have that information. My second pass would be expanding on that concept on the same day. So I would have done that lecture earlier in the day, and then my second pass would be later on in that day. I would expand on those concepts. I would try and answer those questions and try to learn that information. My third pass is the weekend of that week that lecture was taught. That third pass of information is all the little nitty-gritty details of that lecture. And at that point, I would have been familiar with that information. My fourth pass is the final pass, and that is basically the week of the exam. And I am reviewing that lecture so that way I am briefly looking it over and I'm self-testing myself on that information. Depending on your schedule, you want to space it out differently as I do it, but the idea is you need to follow that idea of the spaced repetition where you're following the forgetting curve, where you're spacing out your repetitions by increasing amounts by each repetition that you're doing. Pomodoro Technique. This is coined by Francesco Ciriello back in the 1990s. The foundation of this technique is based off that intermittent mental breaks between intensive study sessions helps you refocus and re-engage with information later on when you study again with another session. Here are some articles that support that taking intermittent breaks between study sessions positively correlate with academic success. Back in undergrad, I would try and sit 6 to 7 hours straight of only studying with no breaks. The problem with this is that after 35 to 40 minutes, I would lose focus, and then that next 5.5 hours were times wasted. The idea here is, with the Pomodoro technique, you are taking 25 minutes of intensive studying without distraction, and then taking a 10-minute break. That 10-minute break, you're going to get up and you're going to go and do something else and then come back. You don't want to stay in the same place. And you want to do 4 sessions of that. So you're going to do 25 minutes, 10 minutes, 25 minutes, 10 minutes, 25 minutes, and 10 minutes. And then you're going to take a longer break, maybe 30 minutes. This has helped me re-engage and refocus and stop being distracted when it comes to studying and procrastinating. Depending on your ability to refocus and how engaged you are with the material, you can actually extend that intensive study session with putting it to 50 minutes or an hour and taking a 10-minute break. Some people do 50 10-minute splits, or some people do 30 10-minute splits, 25 10-minute splits. It just really depends on the way you are studying. If you feel like you're in the groove when you're studying, you probably want to just keep on going until you lose your focus. And then you go and you take your 10-minute break. You go and you do something else, and then you come back and you study again. Last but surely not the least is time management. One of the most important things is time management, regardless if you're studying or not. Time management skills will give you time to do other things outside of studying and be able to organize your life. Not only is it effective in academic success, but it's also effective in reducing anxiety when it comes to deadlines with school. Here are some research articles that support that time management has a positive correlation with academic success. A recent research article that I've read, done by Adams et al., examines the association between self-reported time management within a group of undergrad engineering students and their academic success. Adams et al. Quoted, "Our results contribute to the understanding of students' time management behaviors in relation to their academic performance. This research was undertaken with students within a department of electrical and computer engineering, establishing a clear link between students' time management behaviors and GPA. This study helps to identify potential barriers to student success and offer justification for practical interventions in this area." The results showed that there are two main aspects of time management that positively correlated with academic success. And these are: one, setting goals, and two, prioritizing your time. They did, however, state that time management is not the only factor that plays a role in academic success. And of course, we all know that. It's about the techniques that you use, it's about other things that you do that helps you study better. And what they stated was that there has to be research in all the other factors that help people succeed academically. My advice is to assess your goals and your ambitions and start setting goals. These goals will be split into short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. Your short-term goals should lead to your medium-term goals, and your medium-term goals should lead to your long-term goals. How I implement this is I create a daily to-do list. With the daily to-do list, I have an example here. I would number it from 1 to whatever amount of things that I need to do, and I prioritize the top things first, and then I bring it down all the way to the least prioritizing thing. So that way, if I didn't end up finishing my to-do list, I don't have that anxiety of not finishing that to-do list. The last thing on my to-do list will probably go on to the next day, where I can later get that done. Here on my example, you can see what may be my short-term goals. For example, I have my lectures. My medium-term goals for that would be getting 90% on the future exam. And then my long-term goal for that would be getting great marks as I graduate. Another example would be research for a YouTube video. That would lead to my medium-term goals of creating a YouTube video, and then my long-term goal of creating a successful channel. And then, for example, another thing would be my podcast, where I would do research on my podcast, and then I would record a podcast, and then also create a successful podcast. The idea here is that you're setting yourself up so that way you know what you want to achieve, and you have broken down into steps that leads to that achievement. And so I think with this research article and time management, you're able to be successful, and not only academic success, but also in life success. Hopefully this video has showed you some techniques that could help you become more effective and more efficient in the way you study. These are some techniques that I wish I knew in undergrad, and now that I implement them, I have been getting better grades. As an example, I'm coming out with some more videos in the future on productivity and getting into med school in Canada and then in the US. If you want to see more of these videos, feel free to subscribe. If not, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much.